Gifting, it doesn't. Most commercial activity is sort of prohibited inside the event, even though it's so it's a city without sort of much commerce. There's a communal effort is part of it, participation, and the idea of immediacy. Like, be there, do a thing. There's no audience, and everyone is the audience, but everyone is a performer. Like, there's no strict division. So it's an experiment with a bunch of ideas that are pretty interesting. It is also just a big party. I mean, if you've ever seen pictures of it, it's basically people in crazy costumes or no costume at all and dancing around a giant flaming man and fireworks and, you know, all manner of things. But it has some really interesting aspects. It radically questions the commercial model. There's almost no commerce. You pay a ticket, and once you're in, it's volunteer built and run. It now has permanent staff for the big one in Nevada, obviously, which has got enormous. But the ones that we run here, Burning Seed has no staff. It's all volunteer run. Blazing Swan has one staff member to run a like 4,000 person event. It's basically volunteer built and run. And it now has arts foundations and Burners Without Borders. Community builds community institutions once you have it. I also want to talk about hacker spaces and maker spaces. I helped found this thing, which is basically the idea of a shared physical space for projects. You build a space, you know, it's a group of people get together, they make a shared physical space that they can fill to make things. They sort of hacker spaces for, you know, historical reasons, and people who are involved in the sort of hacker world tend to not think about, you know, breaking into computers and stuff. We just think about making things do things making things do things that they weren't really intended to do is basically the way we think of it. So, so often people call it maker spaces because it's about really a space for making things, and that's a sort of more seen as a more friendlier name. Most of them are independent non-profits. The whole idea is you pull funds to get cool technology, laser cutters, electronic shops, and things. And usually they're also teaching and learning spaces, and just make whatever projects you want. Okay, the space is there. You build the space and then the projects come, right? There is a national scene. There's too many to list. There's actually, I thought, I started listing them and going, oh, well, there's Artifactory in Perth. And then I looked at the list and there's like, oh no, there's like 40 or something nationwide. This is actually, you know, since I last looked, the number has expanded. And it's a bit like the men's sheds movement. Some people would think of it, externally they look very similar. It's a community space to make things. But it's quite a different kind of vibe, younger, geekier, not specifically male, different goals. The men's sheds is a bit more about the community is really the point, right? Rather than it's a way to get men together to talk to each other and so on. And it's often sort of funded by the government as essentially a mental health project or community mental health project. Whereas the hackerspace is much more, it's funded by the people who do it. We get very, very little government support for the most part. We just pool our money and very focused on getting access to really cool technology we wouldn't otherwise get, like giant laser cutters and things like that. Hackerspaces.org is a global network about it if you're interested in this movement, and has many shared resources for setting you up and lots of advice. But essentially they all differ slightly in how you set them up, and you know, some are a little bit commercial, some are much more non-profity or charity, some are, and they're global, so of course it's going to change. And there's also very different physical spaces, and you know, some of them are into much different things. Particularly, I was involved in having found, and I'm an active member, but not an active part of the leadership of the Artifactory, which was the first sort of one in WA. We've sort of got a nice space out sort of near the sort of Inaloo shops, that sort of zone. And we've got a great big warehouse that's also actually a performance space. We have a noise music nights there and other things. The hackerspace now is really widely adopted and imitated, so like libraries offer tools. There's a corporate version of people talk about an innovation lab, which is basically the same kind of idea, but much more as a sort of corporate thing, often sort of hanging off the side of a co-working space, like I think there's one in the middle of town hanging off Flux, which is the new Space Cubed facility. Fab Labs is a more sort of academic version, came out of academia, out of MIT and sort of. Also a little bit about science fiction fandom, where I spent a lot of my time. I've very pioneered the volunteer-run event model. Science fiction fandom has been running volunteer-run conventions since the 1940s. It's created many lasting international cultural institutions. Like a lot of these sort of science fiction fandom things are like 40 or 50 years old now. It's sort of a victim of its own success. because the internet just went crazy and mutated the fandom model beyond anyone's expectations. So it's a little bit unrecognisable to people who, or confusing to people who've been at it a long time. They're like, who are these people? But what you probably think of as a science fiction convention is probably a commercial event that we would call an expo or a gate show. I'm talking about the fan-run versions, which are generally smaller, and most of the content is community discussion, critical and reflexive. The guests are usually creative professionals like writers, and usually you don't pay the guest, which is in contrast to the commercial ones, which usually pay actors who charge large appearance fees. And within the science fiction fandom here, I'm talking about the professional fan-run communities have huge overlap. Like the writers are all often active members of fandom, and there's a big overlap, and we don't really think of ourselves as audience and community. They think of those as very overlapping things, in contrast to, say, you know, the TV and film model. And also I do stuff involved in digital rights activism, in particular around Electronic Frontiers Australia. It was a national organisation for civil rights in electronic communications, 22 years old, never had a real office, mostly volunteer run, almost entirely run by online spaces, and has actually been pretty effective for an organisation that has no sort of physical presence and is mostly volunteer run. Notably, we beat Stephen Conroy's national web filtering proposal and sort of cut that out. So, but the real point is sharing some lessons from these. I'm talking about, I've put this in terms of patterns, and which is an idea that it's a computer science thing. I'm a programmer. This is one of the ways in which we share ideas and things, is we talk about design patterns, which is actually an idea that we totally stole from a famous book about architecture. But it's a standard, the idea you get a standard approach to solving a problem, and don't put too much into the detail. You just go, this is a standard approach. What are some ways to do it well? What problem does it solve? When is it appropriate to use it? And I'm trying to approach that to designing, give you some ideas about how to make a good volunteer-run organisation work well in that model. And there's also the idea of anti-patterns, which is kind of the opposite, the complementary concept when you have standard problems that result from particular approaches, and you know how you get that problem, and maybe how you might try not to do it. And there's also some things where there are choices, which we need to sort of talk about. There are times when there are different approaches that do work but are incompatible. So one of them is building a very, a lot of them about with choice of physical space or not, and things like that is one where you have to make a choice. What are the pros and cons? There's actually multiple models that work, but which one is right for you? Or you need to work out what kind of effort. There's multiple kinds of activism or volunteer-run thing you can do, and sometimes you've just got to sit there at the start and go, what sort are we going to be? And there are some real choices. And that sort of ties back into, like earlier this morning we heard about that the reformist versus revolutionary, for example. They're very different kinds of organisations. And they're complementary. There's not one that's right. Really, I mean, if I was doing a talk about political lobbying, I'd talk about the Overton window, but I'm not, so I won't. So here's one of these design patterns. One that I think is the most important is called do-ocracy. The best way to run your volunteer organisation that really works for a continuing model is the people who do a thing should be in charge of how to do it. It seems obvious, but it's really not. Like, lots of organisations don't work this way, and it really can limit them badly. We confuse leadership, authority, governance, and oversight, right? Real leadership needs to be tied to doing stuff. You need to know the person, and need to doing things whatever it is you do. Leaders who do things well are the best leaders. They automatically have some legitimacy for the organisation because they're able to actually go, well, let's do this because I did it before and it worked and I know how to do it, rather than I read it in a book and I think you should do this the way I am telling you. We have this tendency to think that people with authority are leaders, but they're really not, right? The authority often, you really need authority for governance and oversight, and those are very important things. But the authority should really be in the process and who's leading it for governance and oversight. And you actually don't need to give a leader any, to do real leadership, you only need authority to do the thing that you're doing. You don't need the power to interfere with other people within the organisation or anything like that. It's really got to focus on do what you're doing and separate that idea of authority from leadership, and particularly because authority needs to go with governance, and authority of the whole organisation needs to go with governance and oversight, which are quite different things. Another model design pattern that I like is the container, I call it. I got this word from some of the people involved in Burning Man, but it's a widely applicable concept, which is make the space, community will fill it. If you're trying to build a creative space or something like that, you need the space and the infrastructure before you need the project. Sometimes don't try and get the projects to lead, and sometimes leaving the project undefined or very loosely defined is the best way to go. In particular, the way Burning Man events work is the people who are organising it just make the space. We call it the container. There's a perimeter. There's a perimeter you're in or you're out. We try and keep people from going back and forth. There's no everything that happens in that space, or almost everything, is provided by the people who come. And we say, come bring as much creativity as you possibly can, and they do, and everyone has an amazing time. But it's not like a totally different model to a sort of any other, like at most festivals where here's the lineup ahead of time. These are the people you're coming to see, and these are famous people that you will come and enjoy the work. Burning Man is like, oh no, you're going to come and see what other people brought, and often that's far more amazing. Same thing with, on a smaller scale, with sort of science fiction fandom. I run science fiction where most of what people do is talk to each other. I used to talk about running science fiction conventions, running Burning Man. Actually very similar, only instead of a hotel, you're in like an inhospitable desert and everything's on fire. And similarly, the way hackerspaces, that's very much, they have their own design patterns and discussion and so on, and they say, infrastructure first, then build the projects with the infrastructure. Your community will come and make amazing things. Don't feel that you have to force it or push it. Just make the space. And then the organisation will the community will fill it. So your community's passionate about the thing that you do. Their creativity is your greatest asset. A creative community is what makes it work rather than an interesting space. How porous your container is varies depending on what you're trying to do. For hackerspaces, we like that container to be very porous. Someone wanders in with an idea that they just like, oh, I heard you guys got a laser cutter and I've got this thing that I really want to do. And we go, yeah, sure, cool, there you go. The only thing we're going to do is make sure you're trained to use the equipment and then just go use the equipment. Whereas Burning Man has a quite rigid container, for that weekend. Like anyone can come in and be part of the community, but when the event's on, we just try to stay inside, not go back and forth. Reward with happiness is another thing. The way you should be making your rewarding your volunteers is by making them enjoy it. They like doing things. Doing a job well is rewarding. They like doing the thing. Just let them do the thing. Camaraderie is important. Recognition is vital. Another model is assume you have flaws. Anticipate bad behaviour. You'll have a great community. It's full of loving people. It will have also some terrible people. Or people who, for whatever reason, end up doing terrible things. You put mediation, complaint procedures, code of conduct as soon as you can. Just off the shelf, I pulled it out of some web pages. Better than nothing. And often better than the one you think is well tailored to your community, because your community you've probably made that reactively in response to problems. Don't give volunteers any slack on behaviour, or celebrities or rock stars. Pass knowledge on is very important. You must structure your organisation to pass on knowledge. Give people who've done a job ways to pass on the knowledge that is easy and pleasant, right? Make sure people have opportunities to pass on their knowledge. Roles first, then people. If you want to grow your organisation, create jobs before you have the people to put in them. And then when someone comes up and volunteers for your organisation, hey, I want to help, you go, oh, excellent, I've got these 3 jobs that need doing, and they immediately can get up and start running and doing things. They don't need to be unique jobs. You can be like, oh, well, we definitely need more people on that team, but just make sure there are things for people to do. They can engage immediately. Particularly, there's a good bit in this on a book called Swarmwise by Rick Falkvinge, who's the founder of the Pirate Party. No matter what you think of the Pirate Party, if you're interested in growing volunteer organisations, that book is free. There's also a commercial version that has more interesting anecdotes about his life and stuff, but which I haven't read. But the free version is terrific for ideas about how to grow organisations. And don't let people if you let people tailor the roles to them, it becomes difficult when they leave. because you need to find a clone to fill it. Multiple forms of communication. If you're building a virtual organisation, you need at least a repository, an asynchronous means of communication, and real-time, by which I really mean you need a wiki or something like that, you need a mailing list, or wiki or a giant file store or something to just keep long-term records. You need a mailing list so people can work out what's going on that week, and you need some form of chat so people can actually communicate in real time. Social media is external facing. Don't think of it as part of your organisation infrastructure. Think of it as part of your communications, right? Try and keep your social media as away from dependency on a company whose job is not necessarily to help you. The future is a job. Have a role process. If you want your organisation to grow, have someone whose job is to get new volunteers. And focused on that. Don't just leave it as a floating amorphous thing. Everyone who's actually working will be too busy to do a good job. Some anti-patterns. Money ruins things. We all know that, but rewarding volunteers with money is terrible. Often terrible. Behavioural economics here is, economics used to be this thing that presumed everyone was perfectly rational and always made this perfectly rational decisions. They don't. We are not homo economicus. In theory, giving volunteers an extra $10 means they're $10 happier. In practice, their mindset changes, and instead of being, I'm a volunteer who's enjoying doing what I am, they're like, man, this job pays shitty wages. Pay people full-time if you have to, but avoid the, I'm just going to give you a little bit of money or something. It's perfectly okay to reward them with things that would cost money and are necessary to do their job, right? Pay, if they need to be on site, pay for them to be on, help them get on site. If they need, they need to wear some sort of uniform, buy it for them. Give them tools and things, but don't give them just money or something that is just a nice reward unrelated to the job, because then they start thinking of themselves as underpaid jobs rather than happy volunteers. Money can flow around you. That's great. So if someone takes the skills or the reputation or something that they've got from working on your event and then finds a way to make money out of that, that's fantastic. People's skills and so on can be, but be careful whenever it flows directly from you to a community member, even if they are doing a job for you. Like if they are doing a job for you as a paid contractor because they've been doing it, then move them out of your management. Let them concentrate on doing that job. It creates misincentives. Some organisations don't even give the leaders a free ticket to event. This is the case for both science fiction conventions and Burning Man, for example. They don't, we will constantly have people who are used to working on commercial festivals, because for-profit events love giving people freebies because it's basically cheaper than paying people to do the work. But if you're a solid volunteer-built, keep that, think very carefully about giving people even free tickets to the event that they're working on. We had this problem with Burning Man. We constantly have people going, oh, well, just turning up. I don't have a ticket, but I'm willing to help out. We're like, well, yeah, you and 25% of the people here, and including me. So, so avoid the wrong incentives when people want the leadership for the wrong reasons, because resources attached, prestige is attached, career building. It's a real issue. Overvaluing oversight is another one, which relates to this idea of, we tend to give authority to the people doing the oversight role, and maybe actually we over-reward people for oversight role. You need to, if you're doing that oversight job, you need to be prepared to pitch in and help as well, right? You need to. It's this idea of having the board that just sort of hovers above everything, but also tries to control too much. It's not that you shouldn't have an oversight board, but you need to think very carefully about giving those people too much sort of authority and power and so on. There's also some choices. Spaces is always a terrible one to make. Hardest choice for many organisations, because having your own space is often a massive money eater and is often a massive source of risk. Like you can't, if you have a space, you need to be insured. You need to think about what will happen if the space gets taken away. You need to think about what will happen if the person who owns the space suddenly decides they don't like what you're doing. Huge number of risks, and often, as I said, massive money eater, which will dominate your organisation's future. And it's very painful to revisit and move as well. Always difficult, huge influence on what your organisation. There is no right answer. That's right. So you have to think very carefully about how you tailor that to your organisation. Structure. You always have to think about legal structure, but association versus company versus co-op. But more important, really, is the internal structure. You do have to have oversight. You do need to have a board. You do need to manage risk and all those things. How do you structure that? Do you have a separate oversight board that sits there, or do you have a separate subcommittee to the side, or how do the operational people, if they're not happy with the organisation, or the other way around, what's the operational oversight? There's no right answer for these as well. Some of these things have to be tailored to what you're doing. Very different, say, for activism versus sort of, essentially entertainment or community building events or things like that. And what your risks are. I mean, obviously for the hacker spaces, usually you have a lot of heavy machinery that's insanely dangerous around, so they have to take risk management very, very seriously. And just saying, assume your own risk is not enough. Controlling growth, your organisation, if you want it to grow, you need to really be very sure about what your core activities are. Do you want that growth to be enforced or controlled? Do you want it to be organic? Do you have intellectual property you want to protect, or is that a way to protect what your organisation is doing? Examples of this are the hackerspaces. There is no central control. Most of the hackerspaces have different names and no obvious connection to each other than people inside that space recognise them as being the same kind of thing. But Burning Man had controls its Burning Man trademarks, controls, and they see a huge amount of risk in that their reputation as being one of the greatest parties on earth means that they're in constant danger of commercial operators trying to co-opt that, and they do have to protect. They have chosen to trademark things and do a lot of work to protect those 10 principles. They're not that inflexible. We actually change some of them, and the leave no trace is specific to theirs. We often tend to think of that instead as leave the space better than it was, which is actually kind of different, but they're not inflexible, but they are very wary of commercial co-option. And that's all I've really got, so over to you. We'll talk about patterns, anti-patterns advice later, and thanks and good luck.
Thanks.